Hello everyone and welcome back to the Code Syndicate. In this video, we will be discussing about functions. Functions are the building blocks of the Rust program. A function is a set of statements to perform a task. Functions are flexible in nature. That means we can reuse the functions whenever we need. Defining a function. To define a function, we have this special keyword called fn. We start with fn and followed by the name of the function. Name of the function can be anything, but it should be written in snake case. That means you cannot use capital letters and special characters except dash, and make sure to not start the name with numbers. Fn followed by function name and parentheses, and finally opening and closing of the curly braces. Inside the curly braces, we can have our Rust code. For example, functions are by default do not execute by their own. We need to call it either in the main function or in any other function. For example, before we run this code, let's talk about this main function. I have talked about it in my earliest videos, but for the better understanding, I will discuss it again. As the name suggests, this main function is the main executive block of our Rust program. Or I can say it is the only executive block of a Rust program. Any function or code needs to be called in this main function to be executed. Any code outside of this main function will have no effect in the outcome. Now, let's run this code to see if it is working or not. Perfect. As I said, the functions are reusable. So let's call this function again to confirm its reusable nature. Here you can see we have two hello world printed in the console. Let's see how we can take parameters in a function and pass the arguments while calling it. Let's define a function named add. This function will take two arguments, a and b, both of type i32. Parameters are defined this way. First, we write the name of the parameter, followed by colon and the type of data this parameter is holding. We use comma to separate multiple parameters. Now, let's add some logic inside this function. Here, we are adding these two parameters a and b and storing it in the variable sum, and finally printing it out in the console. Let's call this function with arguments. To call this function, we need to provide two valid arguments. By valid, I mean the type of data this function accepts as parameters. Here, we are providing 5 in the place of A and 7 in the place of B. Remember, this A colon and B colon is generated by this Rust analyzer. So ignore this. By our logic, we should get 12 in the output. Let's run the code. Perfect. Now let's demonstrate its reusability again. Run the code. Here you can see we have two statements in the console. Functions with return statement. We can define functions with return statement as well. For this, we will slightly modify our add function. Instead of printing the sum, we will return this sum. Now, as this add function is returning a value, we need to tell the Rust compiler what type of data this function will return by adding this dash and arrow sign followed by the data type this function will return. Now, let's call this function in main. As this add function is returning some value, we need to store this value in a variable. Here we are storing it in the sum variable. At last, we are printing this variable sum in console. See the result. Run the code. Perfect.